everybody. I'm Berit.
And I'm Brett.
And we're married, but we're also business partners.
And our friends and coworkers have to put up with awkward shit like piggyback rides all the time. So I thought we'd start the morning off that way. Today we're going to talk about what we think it means to author the future. And it's a question Berit and I have been really interested in our personal lives, for ourselves, and very broadly, what does it mean to author the future? But at the starting point, we think it's made of three things, fundamentally. Science, creative partnerships, and magic.
Let's start with magic. If there's one thing that makes me believe in magic, it's the fact that Brett and I actually met on Craigslist. No, not in the casual encounter section, although that is what we like to tell people we meet at bars. No, I actually moved into Brett's house when I moved to Seattle. And right after we started dating, we developed a casual obsession with the Yes Men. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Yes Men, they're a duo who stages elaborate pranks to make statements about big corporations. And generally, it's companies like Shell and Dow Chemicals and the US Chamber of Commerce. And usually, they do it by pretending to actually be a part of that organization, and then by attending press conferences or doing TV appearances on their behalf. You can see this is kind of the type of thing that they like to do. They stage this as a real Shell advertisement. And watching all of their stunts unfold, we learned something that is, I think, extremely powerful, which is sometimes you have to tell a massive lie to reveal a deeper truth.
And so we wanted to play with this concept before we try anything big and just get a little practice. And the opportunity came up when the Seattle Seahawks went to the Super Bowl for the first time. And Berit found this competition by Canlis, super expensive Seattle restaurant, that was basically saying, all right, whoever can show the best Seahawks pride will win a free dinner for two on Valentine's in the private dining room. It was like a $1,500 dinner.
And really wanted it.
Yeah, Berit really wanted it, but we also knew that there were going to be a ton of people entering, building like Rice Krispie treat pyramids in Seahawks colors with little marshmallow statues, and we didn't have time for that. But we really wanted the dinner, so we said, what's something only we could do that really represented us? That was our starting point. So we devised a hoax, and this is an image that was photoshopped by our good friend Garrett Kellogg. And we combined it with a very elaborately written crosscut article that basically said that Paul Allen and the CEO of Boeing had a competition of who could show the most Seahawks pride. And we figured, it would fool some people, but folks would generally get the joke. That wasn't the case. The article got posted at 11:35 p.m., and 10 minutes later, it crashed the crosscut site. It had gone viral, and multiple Seattle news anchors made it their profile picture. ESPN called wanting to know about the story. John Cook, the head of GeekWire, was asked constantly about it. And 6 months later, Russell Wilson even posted to his Facebook profile. Who knows if he thought it was real or not? I mean, the guy believes in miracle water. But
luckily, my coworkers were very understanding.
Yeah. A couple days later, the Canlis brothers went on TV and announced that we had the winner, and we had an awesome Valentine's evening in the private dining room.
It turns out it's very comfortable up there.
So when we set out to, Berit and I we decided, we kind of like this thing, it's working, we decided we want to get married. And when I thought, what's the best way I could ask her to marry me? And I once again started from the point, what's something that's uniquely us that only we could pull off? And so my friends and I devised this ruse where I told Berit that I was going to be testifying before the Seattle City Council about artificial intelligence use in government.
Which, is something that your husbands sometimes do.
And, but instead what happened is I got up there and started talking about robots and everything else, and started to shift a little bit the conversation.
About halfway through the testimony, I realized that the city council meeting was going to be a little bit different than I expected. And eventually the council president, Sally Clark, invited me up to the front of the room to cast a deciding vote. The council had already voted. It was a tie between whether or not we should get engaged. I was really pissed at the council members who voted against the engagement, but we'll save that for another time. So this whole thing really just sucked me into this magical vortex of laws and norms, where just for a minute, I actually got to be a council member. And I actually got to cast the deciding vote for my own engagement. And yes, it was legally binding. So a note of caution about magic. It turns out that when you cast a spell during a very public ritual, it can have unintended consequences. So Brett gave me this really amazing fox ring when we got engaged. And it turns out that particularly when that spell involves this ring, and the foxes happen to be on the edge of their exponential takeoff as the newest hipster spirit animal, your friends and family will start to flood you with fox presents. And let's just say that our friends and family love us very much, and we're very lucky. Oops. Oop. So that brings me to the second part of what it takes to author the future, which is creative partnership. Now, there seems to be this idea out there that if you want to author something, you have to really be alone. You need to lock yourself up in a little tiny cabin by the sea and just hibernate for several weeks at a time. But that's absolutely false. Authoring the future is not a solo activity. And in fact, it's something that you can only do with the help of other people's ideas and your friends and their support, and by engaging in lots of interesting conversations. It's something that is shaped by culture and your relationships with other people. You cannot do it alone. And Brett and I got to experience this for the first time together at Future in Review. Now, Future in Review is a conference that my family runs that predicts trends in technology and economics. Every year brings together people like Elon Musk and Vint Cerf and Michael Dell, many others. And those people come together every year to talk about where technology is going. So the two of us started to work together on this conference. We organized panels, we developed media strategy for the conference. We even put together games to play at the conference because technologists aren't always that great at just having fun. And we saw firsthand the power of Pardon me. We saw firsthand the power of what happens when you work together with award-winning documentary filmmakers, economists, C-level executives, and Nobel-winning scientists to solve problems like climate change and human trafficking and building the next great chip. And we saw that these are guys that are coming together every year to work on these things. And they're making a little bit of progress every year. They are not doing it alone.
So Berit and I started having fun with these creative partnerships we were having, and for a while we thought, maybe we could start a project or a business together. And we're excited about that. But there were a couple of stipulations we both had in mind. One, we didn't want to do it just 'cause. And the other is we wanted to make sure we had a shared vision of what we were trying to do. So to test that, we had an idea maybe it could be a media company or something like that. And we decided to go to Mexico for 2 weeks. And the first week, the only goal was to drink tequila on the beach. The second week was to figure out, is this something we really want to do? And do we have a shared vision? So the second week, we rented a house in Merida, Mexico. And we turned an entire room into a brainstormatorium where we talked about what are our life goals individually? What are the things we're trying to do and the impact we're trying to realize with our work? How do we want to grow our skills? And then we came together and compared those. And it turned out that we did have a shared vision, something we were surprisingly, something we're both excited about. And that's why we launched the company we're currently working on, which is called Scout. And what Scout does is it combines reporting on technology with near-term science fiction. And the goal is we want to use a combination of fiction and nonfiction to explore what are the social implications of science and technology. Who in society is it going to affect? And get outside just the normal conversation of gadgets and which company bought who. And for us, the reason why we're doing that is we guide ourselves with a kind of nerdy mission statement that we want to be involved in accelerating the creation of a better future. And we think we can do that through stories and conversations and prototypes. And that brings us to the third part of authoring the future, science. Now, I don't have to tell any of you that we're living in a really crazy and confusing age of accelerating technological innovation. And you see things like drones building bridges and reusable rockets, not just one billionaire, but two having an active pissing match on Twitter. This week, Google brought the self-driving car to Kirkland. And there are now genetically modified spider-goat hybrids whose milk produces bulletproof skin. This is not made up. Look it up. But if some of these things sound familiar, it's because they've been described in science fiction for decades.
Now, here's the thing about science fiction. a lot of people haven't really discovered it yet. And that's because many people think that science fiction is just a bunch of like giant phallic spaceships ramming into each other over and over, creating giant explosions. And I was actually one of those people until just a few years ago when my book club decided to read DUNE. So those of you who have read DUNE may know that there are a few space scenes in there. But DUNE is also a book about resource wars, and it's a book about climate and religion and spirituality. It's a book about politics and economics, and it's a book about faithfulness. And most of all, it's full of powerful women. And those are all of my favorite things. And so once my bias against science fiction was really torn asunder, I started reading more of it. Damon, Nexus, all of Paolo Bacigalupi's stories, Blueprints of the Afterlife. I read Ready Player One, which is about virtual reality. And I realized that science fiction wasn't just a source of nerdy entertainment. Science fiction is a phenomenon that brings together authors and technologists and other wickedly smart individuals. And it brings them together to simulate the cultural and economic impacts of technology. Now, you could make the argument that science fiction is predicting the future. Or you could turn that argument on its head and say that science fiction is actually serving as a blueprint for technology. And that's what Seattle-based science fiction author Neal Stephenson had in mind when he teamed up with Arizona State University to start something called the Hieroglyph Project.
So the Hieroglyph Project is something really exciting, and Neal Stephenson's core insight is that you could look at these science fiction writers as predicting the future, or you could flip it on its head and say these were some of the most compelling storytellers of their age. And they crafted these infectious ideas that he calls hieroglyphs. And that these hieroglyphs then went into the public imagination and either subconsciously or consciously informed their intellectual curiosity, funding strategy at grants at universities, and then created something that people could coalesce around. The problem Neal Stephenson identified, though, is that all of our hieroglyphs or our stories of the future are increasingly dystopian and apocalyptic. He said we need a new set of hieroglyphs of visions of a positive future that we can organize and build towards. And so Berit and I were really inspired and excited by this idea, but we wanted to know, is this thing real? So we started talking to people that were at DARPA and the White House, and then some of these authors that were involved that are now Scout contributors, people like Greg Baer and Ramez Nam and Carl Schroeder and Brenda Cooper and Madeline Ashby. And what they told us was this fascinating story. And it's kind of the sort of secret history of how science fiction has influenced and shaped the 20th and 21st century. And it starts with the fact that for the last 70 years, science fiction authors have worked very closely with some of the biggest institutions on the planet. The CIA, the Department of Defense, Bell Labs, Google. And these are places that have access to the best researchers and analysts, but they still find value in using story as a thinking tool to unlock insights and envision where the future could go. This was the recent chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Martin Dempsey. He was a big proponent of science fiction during his tenure, but he said the true gift is the ability to be provocative and its power to develop the professional imagination. Now, one of my favorite and mind-blowing stories about this I learned recently is that President Ronald Reagan, when he was in the White House, he would receive regular science fiction briefings on world affairs. He would get 2 pages just for the president that he could skim and doodle on, and then he'd get 30 to 45 pages for his policy wonks. Now, it's fascinating to think what role did that play in shaping his view of reality and the world, and how did that play into funding priorities at the Department of Defense or the national budget. But the thing is that these stories that get told to engineers and designers and politicians, they're the ones that come alive and end up getting created. Because as my friend Alex Steffen says, you can't build what you can't imagine. And so we end up building what has most influenced our imagination. And understanding this is really, really important if you want to know where technology and society is going. And the reason why is because we're living in this crazy time of the hyper-empowered individual. And I mean hyper-empowered. There's a growing group of people that have tens of billions of dollars of personal wealth and are at the helms of companies with hundreds of billions in market cap. And many of them have openly admitted that science fiction has had a huge role in shaping their view of the future and the world and where it should go. And they mentioned folks like Arthur C. Clarke and Isaac Asimov and Greg Bear and Kim Stanley Robinson. And these people are, when you look at what's going to happen with self-driving cars or what's going to happen with the economy, it's no longer just fundamentals and what the market thinks. It's what do these people think, and what do they want, and what are the stories they're trying to bring to life. And it's not just for the billionaires. This amplifies and changes their recruiting and how they build their companies. Right? When Elon Musk talks about colonizing Mars, engineers who read Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars trilogy hear those stories and get excited and flock to it.
So we're now entering the age where we're starting to ask ourselves some really important questions. Questions like, who owns our data? And how will genetic augmentation affect class and privilege? And what does it mean that artificial intelligence is going to start governing our lives in new ways, either through private institutions or public institutions? And so I want to take a minute and just ask you guys a question about this group up here. What do you notice about this group? Yes, they are all white men. A lot of them are awesome progressive white men, but they are all white men. So these guys up here are actually actively simulating and imagining what the future looks like every day. And they're also working every day to try to author the future. So they'll come up with some really good stuff. In fact, they have come up with some good stuff already. But we need more people to be involved in that process. And as it turns out, we need more perspectives to be involved in that process, more diverse perspectives. We need more artists and inventors, because at the end of the day, authoring the future should be a democratic process. It should be something that we are all involved in. So, how do we get there? Number one, understand, this is where you guys are actually all ahead of everyone else that's not sitting in this room right now. Understand that there are people out there every day who are actively working to author the future. Knowing that that is an invisible layer that influences all of our lives is important, either to figuring out how to author your own future or aligning yourself with the right stories. Now, what does it mean to author your own future? This is an early journal from Octavia Butler. Now, for those of you who don't know who Octavia Butler is, she's one of the most famous sci-fi authors ever, and she just also happens to be a black female. But she accomplished so much in her life, and she's from the Seattle area. And early on in her career, she started off by being very intentional about what she wanted to accomplish. And this is from before she really got famous at all. And she said, "My novels will go on to the above list whether publishers push them hard or not, whether I'm paid a high advance or not, whether I ever win another award or not." And by writing this out, Octavia was actually able to visualize this and to make those goals and those dreams a reality for herself. So the second is something that's probably best said by Neil Stephenson himself. Now, we ran into Neil at a conference a couple of months ago, and we asked him to sign his new book, 7 Eves, for one of our co-founders, Michael Kamink. Michael is an amazing guy, but like me, he is a rather recent entry into the field of loving science fiction. And so we told Neil this, and we asked him to write something to Michael to inspire him to read more science fiction. And his words were, for those of you who can't read his scribble, "Read more science fiction, you dumb fuck." So I would echo these words to you today. Read more science fiction so that you can be an active and effective participant in the companies and the stories that are shaping our world right now. Starting in March, I would say this even if this weren't my company, but starting in March, Scout will be publishing weekly dispatches on the future of technology and science that are combining science fiction and reporting. And we hope you'll become a member.
And finally, we want to leave you with an invitation to while you consider what authoring the future means for you, just keep in mind science, magic, and creative partnership as part of that equation. And for the technologists in the room, I invite you to appreciate that magic and imagination is a crucial part of what you do. And for the designers and activists and artists, as things heat up, don't just withdraw from technology or take pot shots at Silicon Valley. It's going to take a collaboration between technologists and creatives to get the future right. And science fiction is a fantastic place to play and have a real impact. Because if we're going to have a just and democratic future, it's going to take an army of artists and activists working in concert with technologists who care deeply about the ethical implications of their brilliant work. Thank you very much.
Any questions?
Questions?
Oh. Yeah, in the back. I think we have a roving mic. So just wait for the mic to come to you.
So for those of us that are unfamiliar with Scout, can you tell us a little bit, you told us what it does, but can you tell us, or what you intend to do with it, but can you tell us like how you're going to do it and what are the aspects of the company, like what, you know, a little more details, because
Yeah,
sounds
absolutely.
cool.
So that was an easy one. Thanks for that one. So we are combining science fiction and journalism to cover the future of technology. And what we're doing is we're focusing on one bigger topic at a time. Our first issue will focus on artificial intelligence and climate and how those two intersect. Both ways that they're intersecting now and ways that they could be used together in the future. And for our first issue, what we're focusing on, we'll be releasing weekly dispatches. So every week, as a Scout member, you will get in your inbox a collection of stories that are both science fiction and reporting about that topic. And you'll also get invited to events, member events around, we'll be staging events in Seattle and San Francisco, probably New York eventually, major cities, so that you can not only read about these things, but you can actually come together and talk about these things.
And one of the aspects of the ways we're packaging this is each week has its own mini theme. And it starts with a serial science fiction story that follows a character, a young woman named Ji in China. And each week you'll get an update in how she's experiencing this future. And then that'll be packaged with reports we have coming in from the ground in China and the Philippines, in California. And then there'll be other science fiction vignettes. So the whole idea is getting a look of what that future could look like, simulate it, and then discuss it, and then follow that character and follow that future through line. So that's kind of our starting our MVP, so to speak.
And I would add, one of the things that we're trying to do through this whole process is not just to put out one, mono future out there, but we're trying to introduce the idea that there are a lot of possible futures out there. And we'll be presenting 1 to 2 of those, but the whole goal is to get our members and our readers talking about the diversity of those. And you might disagree with some of the futures that we put out there. That's awesome. We want to hear what you think the future is like.
So I came in late, but I might have missed it. But at Sundance one year, they had a panel where they had science fiction. They had the writer for Another World, the director for Another World, a sci-fi story about parallel universes, and then the scientist that kind of led that theory. And so they had a whole panel where they had some scientists up there and they had the writers up there, and the scientist basically said, just go for it. Like, don't just play with it. Don't worry about time travel. Don't worry about any constraints. Just, we really want to get science in everyone's mind and these theories, however they're interpreted. So that's it.
Well, yeah, I think that's an interesting point. And there's a lot of different science fiction and approaches to this. Some of them is, just go wild with your imagination. Don't worry about getting the physics right or anything else. And then there's others that really care about what they call hard science fiction, where science fiction authors will work very closely with technologists and researchers to make sure that even though they're imagining a future, they're getting the fundamentals right. So you get both, and I don't think there's one that's better than the other. I always think it's funny when you see Neil deGrasse Tyson, anytime there's a movie that comes out, and he just like trolls on Twitter for a week, saying all the little inaccuracies about gravitational pull and whatever. And that's not necessarily what I would do, but I think it's great to have a conversation of, where do we go between imaginative and grounding in known science today? Any other questions?
Yeah.
You touched a little bit upon the issue of the lack of diversity in science fiction authorship. Could you speak a little bit more about what you're thinking can be done to foster more diversity?
So, yeah, absolutely. If any of you guys are interested in reading more works of science fiction by people of color, there's this amazing book that just came out recently called Octavia's Brood. And it's a collection of short stories by authors of color. The woman who wrote it lives in Portland, or she edited it. She wrote one of the stories inside of it. But it's really great. I highly recommend it. And actually, There's an event this weekend called about Afrofuturism. I highly recommend you check out. I don't have the details, I'm sorry. But there is a movement going on within the field of science fiction among authors and people of color. And at Scout, one of the things that we really hope to do, and one of the reasons that we're starting this, is so that we can create room for more of those voices. So yes, we'll be featuring people like David Brin and Greg Bear, but we'll also be hoping to combine those. We won't be hoping to. We will be combining those with writers who have a little bit less, are really talented but are still young and up and coming and maybe haven't had a chance to publish their work elsewhere.
The other thing I think that's key to that is just a realization amongst all of us, whether you get into sci-fi or not, it's understanding the role that science fiction has shaped our conversation, understanding of technology, and knowing that that story has mostly been written, for the last 40 or 50 years by white men. And in many ways, a big group of those folks were very extreme politically. Some of them were homophobic, had very problematic views on race. And in some ways, they kind of colonized our future imagination of where things should go. And just being aware of that and appreciating that element of the world we live in and the implicit dialogue we have around the future is really important so that we can continue to grow and expand our perspective on where we might be headed.
I just want to let folks know there is a very large community of people of color who are sci-fi or speculative fiction authors. The Seattle Public Library actually has several lists. If you look up POC, sci-fi, POC, speculative fiction. There's also a group here called Wild Seed 206, and it's a bunch of Octavia Butler lovers, a bunch of sci-fi folks here in Seattle. So the problem is you have to seek it out.
Yeah.
Right here.
For those of us who are still whetting our appetite for science fiction, what would you say were the top 3 pieces that are important right now that if we're wanting to get into that particular genre to start shaping our future?
I always recommend DUNE just because it's awesome. It's not new. If you're looking for something more contemporary and more like technically, culturally, just feeling like now, I would really recommend a book called Ready Player One. It's about virtual reality, but it's also about social class. It's about all kinds of things, relationships, and what it would look like to live in a world where the world outside is so dark that being in virtual reality is actually like the coolest, best thing that you have.
Yeah, and I would add a couple other books that are great from that standpoint. One is Damon by Daniel Suarez,
Yeah.
and I learned about that a couple years ago. Someone told me that when they were working at DARPA in the 90s, everyone was crazy about Snow Crash by Neil Stephenson. And they're like, find me something described in Snow Crash and it will get funded. And a couple years ago, the book that DARPA was really interested in was Damon. And Damon actually explores technology that could have existed 5 years ago, of where a narrow script AI could run out of control and do some interesting things. And it also explores what could a 21st century political revolution look like, using augmented reality and other things. Fascinating, quick read.
Yeah. If you read Damon, definitely read Freedom, which is the follow-up book.
The follow-on, yeah. And then another one, which is a little bit different, is a book called Blueprints of the Afterlife by Ryan Boudinot. And he got in a little hot water for, he used to be the head of the Seattle City of Literature Project. But the book is fantastic because it's like if Tom Robbins and Neil Stephenson had a love child, and is really cool, futuristic, but has very playful prose, and it's just really enjoyable. You'll read it quickly and it'll blow your mind.
It seems like when we try to address the issues of diversity, we look to the adult population, which is already a self-selected population. And a lot of, I have a kid, that was, people make mistakes, right? But science and people's stories and history and all these things are too important for us to continue to allow the schools to make it be boring. Are there plans for getting to kids before they self-select themselves out of these important things because all their exposure to literature and people's stories and science and math has been dull and not for them?
Yeah, despite the best intentions of the U.S. public school system, one of the highest selling forms of fiction is actually young adult fiction. So there are a lot of the good news is that kids are still reading, and they're voraciously reading. And as you've seen with things like the Hunger Games, they're actually interested in stories that talk about some of these issues. I don't know if you want to talk more about education specifically.
Yeah, I mean, whether they're the Divergent series, Hunger Games, I think it's great because it gets people thinking from a political standpoint, but it is very dystopian. And I think writing that line between honoring all the things that are wrong with the world and then also organizing around something that's interesting is really important. And for me, reading science fiction got me really into science and math. And that was a motivation in my math and science classes. And I had good grades when I was reading sci-fi, and I had bad grades when I wasn't. And I think there's a lot of things that can be done to bring those stories in at a younger age and know that it's not it's a false choice between going into STEM or going into the humanities or arts,
yeah.
right? And that they feed off one another, even in one individual.
Yeah, in the back. Oh.
So we're talking about, excuse me, children and different races. What about cross-culturally and sort of globally? What are the different sort of approaches or things that you're seeing when it comes to science fiction, artificial intelligence, that type of thing?
Well, there's actually a really interesting history of science fiction in China. For a long time, science fiction was banned in China. And until recently, the Communist Party realized that they did a survey of scientists and wanted to know why is there not more invention happening in the country. And they identified a list, but one of them was that science fiction, they didn't have it like Western and South American and scientists did. And so you're seeing a big resurgence in sci-fi in China right now. But I think that that's a really fascinating question that we're interested to explore, because there's a very rich South American science fiction community. There's a very rich African science fiction community, and you don't see a lot of crossover right now between the communities of readers and writers, and seeing those stories blend. And I think that's something that'd be great that we want to explore.
Hey, so I'm actually curious about the intentionality of the Scout platform, because to me, science fiction implies subjectivity. And I think that news platforms inherently have an implicit bias just by what they're reporting on. And so I'm curious if you've thought at all about what the Scout platform, how you'll kind of flow between objectivity and reporting and then subjectivity of authoring the future, and kind of what that looks like.
Yeah, that's something we've thought. We've thought a lot about that. We've talked a lot about that. One of the things we want to encourage is open dialogue and different ideas about what the future looks like. But we also, I have a background in journalism, and I've always thought that the idea of any source being able to be purely objective is bullshit. But that being said, you are able to present facts as you see them in a very clear and non-diluted way with your opinion and your analysis. So part of what we're doing to start is we're very clearly delineating between straight reporting and analysis and science fiction. We want people to understand what they're getting. But we're also, we also think that we're doing a lot of work and we're doing a lot of research around these things, and that has unearthed some opinions and ideas that we have. And so we're not afraid to say this is what we found after reading through all of this stuff, and to augment that with other reporting in science fiction.
Yeah, and I would add, I think there's three things we're trying to address this. One is not having a mono-futuristic view of where things are going. And that idea of monofuturism, think about that when you go out and read news articles, because people talk about the future. And that can be an inherently disempowering idea. It's like we're on this inevitable train and technology is going to do it. But don't buy into that story, because we have a choice. Right? We have a choice of how technology applies in society. The second is, as Berit mentioned, is I think one of the problems with reporting of any kind, but especially in technology, is there's a blend between speculation and fact. Right? And it's just murky in the same article. And we want to let our speculation be our speculation and our fact be our fact. And the third is we're working on coming up with kind of our own core tenet of, we don't have strong political beliefs, but we want to be clear about some of the things we value. And the three things that we identify is, one, climate change is real and is a threat that has to be dealt with. Two is that democracy is having a problem and needs an upgrade. And 3 is that the social contract needs to be renegotiated or re-examined. And we don't prescribe what that looks like, but we're just trying to be transparent. This is kind of where we come from and are important questions. So yeah, that's one of those things where we want to talk about all solutions, but if you don't think climate change is real, like if you don't read science, then Scout's not the place for you.
Yeah.
What do you mean how the social contract needs to be renegotiated? Can you say more about that?
Yeah, I think that you're seeing more. I would say a big reason that we're seeing Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders both rise the way they are is that there's this populist energy and anger around the way the economy is playing out. And I think we have an opportunity to either look forward of what could future solutions be or revert back to the same arguments we had the last century about how to deal with economic problems and wealth distribution. And then the other is we really want to help people understand that robotics and artificial intelligence are here. And they are having real impacts on the economy. And politicians and people in the government are not fully taking that into account and what that means for the social contract. We don't want to prescribe what the solution is, but one example is, so we've got a major transit funding initiative coming up this fall. It could be kind of a once-in-a-decade funding initiative. It has no mention of even evaluating the role of self-driving cars, right? There's no conversation happening in Puget Sound public discourse about what that means. There was even a Transit 2040 Puget Sound survey that was updated 2 years ago, no mention of self-driving cars. So that's the example where we want to get people to think.
And yet, self-driving cars are already being rolled out in Kirkland.
Yeah. So that's an example where how can we examine that social contract and not just revert to technophobic backlash, or not just like say the singularity is going to solve it all, or have the political arguments of the last century. So that's the prompt we want to invite.
Yeah.
I'll follow up a little on your question about democracy being broken. I heard G. Willow Wilson, who writes the Ms. Marvel comic.
She's awesome.
Yeah.
And I heard her at TEDx Rainier, and she had a really interesting take on today's young people. I mean, not just to go millennial, but to say how some of the dystopian works were really looking at how the system has to break first, but we'll build it forward. And it was very interesting because she was very positive talking about kind of the dystopian works. I'm curious if you guys can comment on that regarding democracy.
Well, her book, Aleph the Unseen, is one of my favorites.
Yeah.
It's fantastic. And she actually said that she wrote that book because she had 3 groups of friends that she wanted to have a conversation around. And those were hackers, political activists, and people who care about spirituality. And so she wrote that book to try and create common currency between them.
I would say also, I think in some ways that's already happening, right? We've had a Congress for the last 2 or 3 years that has been unable to get most things done. And that's why we're seeing people who are so excited about Donald Trump on the one hand and so excited about Sanders on the other hand. And there's actually a lot of overlap between those two groups. It's because there is a recognition in general among American people that the current system of government is broken in some ways, and it's just not working anymore the way that it's set up currently. And so I think people are ready for that, and you're actually already seeing some of what G. Willow Wilson was talking about.
Yeah, and I think you'll start to see some pretty radical stuff. I think we're going to enter an age of what I call political weirding, if we haven't already. And one example, one experiment that just got announced from Australia, there have been people talking about this for a couple years, but they're now launching it. It's a platform called Flex. And the idea is they want to run an algorithm for a parliament seat. And the idea is that once in, there'd be a distributed platform where people can vote and have an impact not just once every 2 years, but every time a vote comes up. There's all sorts of problems with that. There's all sorts of issues. But I think you're going to see more and more things like that.
And then on the other hand, in China, you're seeing a virtual currency system set up to control what their citizens are thinking and talking about. So you can actually get points in China under this new system if you do things that are positive for the government.
Yeah.
So those are 2 different approaches, but they're both examples of what's going on out there. Yeah, in the back?
Well, also, like, everyone will be getting on the bandwagon because whoever owns the robots will run the world.
I actually disagree with that statement. I would say that the robots are incidental. It's whoever owns the artificial intelligence that's going to run the world. And I think a lot of people, there's been a lot of conversation about artificial intelligence and back and forth in the last year or two. Elon Musk says that we should be terrified of artificial intelligence. There are a lot of other people out there who say, that's totally ridiculous. Look at, Siri is the best thing we have with artificial intelligence. Or look at those Boston Dynamics robots. They can't even run down the street without falling over. But the thing is, I think there's this artificial conflation between robots and artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence is actually just the brain power that's going on inside of the robots. And that's already being dispatched across a huge sectors of society. On Wall Street, they're using artificial intelligence to make trades and moderate trades.
Yeah. There's two things I'll say on that. One is the conversation around AI is totally dysfunctional, like Berit said. It's either it doesn't work or it's all going to hell. And there's a great line in the AI community that says, it's called artificial intelligence until it works. And basically, a lot of the things that we take for granted now, like machine vision or natural language processing, 10 years ago was considered magic. That was AI. And then once it's built, it's no longer AI. It's just the stuff we put in the system. So I think keep in mind that idea. The other is I'd invite you to consider the possibility of thinking about AI not just as something that lives in a computer, but as a distributed intelligence that takes multiple forms. And one example is you could think of a company as a form of artificial intelligence, whose programming is encodified in law and gets animated through its employees, its supply chain, et cetera. So if we're going to have a conversation around AI, we need to get away from when is the Skynet going to happen, and need to look at where's the technology, where's the actual impact, and where's the leverage.
So forgive me, I don't really ever ask questions, so.
Oh, I'm glad that you're doing it today.
Yeah, so I'm a UX designer, and I'm focused always on solving problems for people in this world today. So it's difficult for me to understand how one can use sci-fi to focus on those problems that are very important to solve today. For example, the homelessness problem we have in Seattle right now is not a very attractive problem to approach from a sci-fi angle. So I guess it's really more of a comment on using sci-fi to guide our future, and I'm speaking as a designer and a community organizer who actually does things today and focuses on today instead of the future. And I guess the quote that would make the most sense to that is the Thich Nhat Hanh quote of, life is available only in the present moment. If you abandon the present moment, you cannot live the moments of your daily life deeply. So it's just a comment.
Yeah. I love that quote, coming from a very wise source. And that is a danger. I've seen it amongst people that are professional futurists, is you can live in the future and not be sensitive to the tension and the needs and the joy of now. And one of the places, I've done a lot of deep thinking on that, and one of the places I realize is that for me the power of visioning and strategic foresight in science fiction isn't necessarily to think about the future, it's to reconceptualize the present. Because I think a lot of the problem is we don't know what the present moment means, right? It's just kind of now, and we're flooded, and that leads us to not be observant or appreciate what's actually going on. And sometimes taking it out a little further helps us see, oh, wow, this is what's going on in politics. Or, oh, wow, this is what's actually going on with homelessness or economic inequality. And science fiction actually has a long history of many of the times it's not about seeing the future, it's about just exaggerating the present so that we can appreciate it. But I think that's a great point.
Go ahead, yeah.
You bring up an interesting paradox, which you bring up a lot of them, but the one that comes to mind is we tend to compartmentalize, we tend to silo things. So we've got the science silo over here and the fiction silo here. We've got, talking about reading books, it's like, yeah, kids can read science fiction at school and they get credit for reading a book. They don't get credit for reading anything academic. It's not they don't get to do a book report on it. They don't get to extract the science from it and do a report on that. It's just, oh yeah, we give you credit, that's cute. So we've got, these places where they put people, and now you've got a publication that's both trying to, and a vision that's both trying to pull these things together and eliminate some of those barriers, while at the same time needing to maintain them. This is science, this is not. So now that you've uncovered and started this problem, what are your thoughts on how you're going to deal with blending those things, working with the silos that people already have, getting rid of the ones that are detrimental, et cetera, et cetera? Good luck.
Sure.
Yeah, so I think intellectual siloing is a big problem, especially in science. I did a project called the International Center for Earth Simulation, and the goal was to build a supercomputing center to model climate risk. And one of the problems is if you want to understand the risk for drought in California, getting the hydrologists to talk to people studying migration patterns and all the factors that go in is almost impossible. They have different conferences, different code switching, all of it. And just to get a complete view of what's drought risk in California look like is incredibly difficult. I think that happens at multiple levels, from K through 12 into the corporate enterprise. One of our partners is this really cool company called CIPHERS, and they actually do science fiction-based prototyping. And they were working with Ford on thinking through what could be a prototype for the future. And there was another company they were working with trying to come up with where things were going. The other company built this amazing 400-page research report with tons of graphs and all sorts of cool things. And then CIPHERS gave them an 8-page comic. Which of those do you think got circulated more amongst the leadership team and the rest of the company, right? So this is part of the solution, is if you can create stories that can be socialized and create common currency for understanding and creativity, that's a platform for that cross-sector collaboration. That's one way, but yeah, I mean, I think we're all in on the problem of dealing with that intellectual siloing, because I don't think it really helps any of us.
Okay.
One more question.
One more question.
Who wants it?
No pressure. Uh-oh. It's not that much pressure, guys. It's really not that much pressure. All right.
I think that's it.
I think we got him.
Yeah.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.